Hi, Stacey. Welcome to Mom on the Verge.
Hi, Katie. Thanks so much for having me.
Oh, I am really excited to have this conversation. The topic that we're going to talk about today, I think, is really important, and I think you have a really great perspective on it. So I'm just really excited to dive in. So we're going to talk about trauma today, and recovery from trauma. And could you just give our listeners a little background on who you are and what you do, and maybe how you came to be so interested in trauma?
Sure. So, by trade, my title is trauma recovery coach. I'm also a
Mhm.
certified hypnotist. I'm certified as a rapid transformational therapy practitioner. But what I really see myself as is a coach and a trauma educator or a trauma specialist. I try not to actually lead with trauma recovery coach because I feel as though a whole bunch of people immediately disclude themselves from needing my help
Mm, mhm,
because they don't understand what trauma is.
mhm.
Once I explain it, they're like, "Oh, okay, yes, actually, I think we
Oh,
do need to have a conversation."
right.
But the way I got to it is the way that I think a lot of people come into this space, which is deep work, awareness, and awakening on our
Mhm,
own traumas and on our
mhm,
own experiences. And when you gain what I call the post-traumatic wisdom that
mhm,
you gain when you've really done the work, it would be hard for you to hold it to yourself,
mhm,
right? And then I also um, built my family by way of adoption. And I did not understand when I was doing that, and my children are much older now, that there was so much trauma coming into the house that I was not made privy to, that I would be having to parent through. And
mm,
I think that there's a lot of parents that I'm friends with in the adoption community that have that same sentiment. And so a big part of my desire to learn about the things that I learned about was also a byproduct of not being able to find the appropriate support for my own family. So it
mhm,
was a combination of me not having the appropriate support for me growing up
mhm,
and going through therapy from the age of 15 to 35 and still having panic attacks 20
mhm.
years later. I'm like, what is wrong? Something's off, something's
Right.
missing. And also being at this vortex of need of getting a deeper understanding of what I was parenting through as well.
Yeah. Okay. That's really great. I think that's going to resonate with a lot of my audience. And so you had started your journey even before you had adopted your children, and then continued on once you saw this need.
I mean, I was on my own personal journey, right? So, like I mentioned, I started therapy at 15 years old. It was 1986.
Yeah.
Who was doing therapy in
Right.
1986 and what
Right. So
15-year-olds
true.
was going? I mean, when I told
Yes.
my mother, you need to take me or I'm going to leave,
Yeah.
I think she was like, oh my God, what's so wrong here? I mean, there were a
Mhm.
lot of things that were very wrong there, but
Yeah.
what is so wrong there? Because at that time, in the 80s, you only went to therapy if you were psychotic or if you were
Mhm.
having a psychosis breakdown, or like the stigma and the understanding was so antiquated.
Mhm.
And I honestly don't know how I knew about it
Yeah. Yeah.
because there was no social media, there was no YouTube. Like, I think about how the kids learn about mental health sometimes. I
Mhm.
didn't have any of that exposure. So I really actually don't know how I knew about it,
Yeah.
but I knew there was someone, I had been privy of someone that I was aware of that could help me. And I basically was like, unless I get it, because I had been asking for it for like a year or two.
Yeah.
And unless you can do this, I'm just going to leave. Like, this is where we're at.
Yeah. And then your parents finally found someone for you.
I found the person.
You found the person. Oh my goodness, were you meant to do this work?
I found the person. I was told it was too expensive. It was
Mm,
$15 a session.
mhm.
I worked, I paid for half of it myself, because I knew if I didn't have it, things were going to go sideways.
Yeah. So I grew up in the 70s, well, the 80s as well. I was born in the late 70s. And there was the same thing. I mean, that was the culture back then. You really didn't go unless you had
A
major
real
psychiatric
problem.
disorder. Like you could not function in the world.
Right.
And my daughter has had a lot of mental health struggles, and we have been through tons of therapy and many different kinds of therapy and all that stuff. And she she just can't get over how when I grew up, the way things were, the way that you were parented, not only that there wasn't therapy, but just, it was like, suck it up, buttercup, like, let's go. There was
Amen.
no, there was no, um, I don't know. There was no empathy or compassion or understanding. I mean, your parents loved you, but they just had this mindset that like, get over it and get on with it.
If it was good enough for me, it's good enough for you.
Correct. And
If
you're the
I
child
didn't
and
need
I'm
it,
the
I didn't get
adult.
it, you're not getting it.
Right. And like, what do you have? Like, what do you have to be in therapy about? Like, your life is perfect. I'm the one who's working a million hours. Like, it just was a very different culture back then.
Yep.
So I'm really grateful for all the progress that we've made. But the mental health system is really still a very complex, complicated space where it is hard often to get the resources that you need. It still can be very expensive. And different types, what I've found on my journey with my daughter is that different types of therapies are more effective for different types of problems, right? So, she really struggled with OCD. So, kind of traditional talk therapy was not getting her anywhere. We did that for a really long time and it really wasn't getting her anywhere. And then we found cognitive behavioral therapy, which was hugely beneficial for her. And I think that's probably true with trauma as well. There's probably specific types of therapy that are better suited for someone who's dealing with trauma.
And the different kinds of trauma. I mean, there's so
And
many
right.
different kinds of trauma, right? You
Yes.
have acute trauma, you have developmental trauma, you can have a physical trauma. There's a lot of different kinds of trauma, and there are different modalities that can be more beneficial. And I think it's a combination of
Hmm.
modalities. I always say it takes a
Yes,
village, right?
it
And I'm
does.
constantly recommending other kinds of practitioners to my clients, not assuming that I'm a one-stop shop.
Right. Absolutely. And I totally believe in that as well. I always say to my daughter, like, you just get all the tools in the toolkit. And then
That's
depending
right.
on what's going on that day, you pull out the appropriate tool. Some days it's a hammer day
Mhm.
and some days it's a wrench day. Like, you got to figure out what works for what issues that, you're dealing with in that moment. But we just have a long way to go in the mental health space. And I'm just really glad there are people like you out there that are bringing not only this healing benefits to people who are in contact with you, but awareness to this topic. So
Mhm.
thank you for the work that you do. So let's get into it. So let's define trauma for our audience. Let's start there.
So here's the thing about trauma. Trauma, the origin of the word trauma is wound.
Hmm.
Okay. So you're a nurse. So this is
Mhm.
going to be great. So, when we think about uh, trauma, there's a couple of things we think about. When we hear about the word trauma, we think it needs to be what I call the 3 A's: acts of violence, aggression, abuse. And anything outside of that, it's like, it probably wasn't trauma,
Mhm.
right? But I have a little sign here behind me. And what that sign says is trauma is never the event. Trauma is the way that the event was interpreted or
Mhm.
experienced, either in your mind, your body, your soul, your psyche.
Mhm.
Okay. Trauma is the way it shifts you, the way it changes you, the way it changes the way that you interact and perceive yourself,
Mhm.
others, and the world around you. So we were talking before we went online. I have this really interesting analogy when it comes to trauma, right? So I like to use weather patterns. So if we're watching the news and we hear that there's a tsunami in Jakarta, or that there's a tornado in the Midwest, or that there's this massive hurricane, or we'll use Katrina for an example, right? Everybody knows, oh my God, that's going to be a problem. That's going to be so traumatic for the people involved.
Mhm.
We know that because we know it's going to have a profound, lasting impact. But we don't really think about this. And it's funny because my husband and I were watching, like, I don't know, Discovery Channel or something last night. and they were showing these people that live in the Antarctic for a year at a time, like
Mhm.
researchers, whatever, and they don't get sun for 6 months. And it really lied into my analogy, which is we know these big weather patterns can be very traumatic. But what about people who live where there's no sun, where there's no warmth for a
Mhm.
year?
Mhm.
That has a profound impact. And it's actually not really designed for the human body, right? Or we find people who live, say, in the Pacific Northwest, where it's not really very dry and it's
Mhm.
usually really cloudy and rainy. That has a massive impact on people's health. We know that,
Yeah.
right? Or maybe
Mhm.
you live in a desert scenario where it's dry and there's not enough humidity and you don't get regulation.
Yeah.
Each one of those things is slightly dysfunctional for
Mhm.
the human experience. And over a long period of time, can have a profound impact on how you navigate the world.
Mhm.
One's no less impactful or profound than the other, it's just different.
Mhm.
So, the space that I tend to work in is what I call developmental trauma. And here's my definition of how it's different from, say, childhood trauma. This is just my unique definition. I see childhood trauma as maybe you had an event in a moment that was very traumatic. Maybe you lost a parent. Maybe you witnessed an accident. Maybe you were in an accident. Maybe you live in a war zone, right? Where you have these like acute situations that are very traumatic and it's going to
Mhm.
have a profound impact. Whereas developmental trauma is a long, persistent, chronic state of stress
Mhm.
during your developmental years, which is like 0 to 12.
Mhm.
People say 0 to 9, but I always say 0 to 12. And when we're defining who we are, and we were talking about the 4 agreements earlier, when
Mhm.
we're defining who we are, when we're creating our belief system, because our belief system is created by the time we're 12, and we're
Mhm.
doing it through a prolonged chronic state of overwhelm or stress, it changes the way that we see ourselves, others in the world around us, because we tend to disconnect from self
Mhm.
in that time. And we tend to shapeshift and kind of chameleon in order
Mhm.
to navigate the stresses. And
Mhm.
we discard and abandon parts of ourself
Mhm.
and we start to take on different parts.
Yeah.
And until we learn how to do that work, which unfortunately doesn't happen till like our 30s, 40s, 50s, when we
Yeah.
realize that we've abandoned self and it's
Yeah.
way in the background and we need to go find the breadcrumbs back to self. Like you were
Mhm.
talking about how it's about coming home to self. That's all I do.
Mhm.
Then we can go back and say, well, let's go back and look at what were some of those milestones during those developmental years where it could have been just this dysfunction. It didn't have to be abuse, violence, or aggression,
Mhm.
where it shifted the way that you perceived yourself and
Mhm.
therefore it affected how you navigate others in the world. When we can go back and see the core beliefs you created in those moments that I do under hypnosis, we can also reframe them, thank them, but they're no longer relevant. And let's install new beliefs that are more relevant and more
Mhm.
poignant to not just your time in life, but the resources you have
Yeah.
within you, right?
Mhm. And so I guess my question would be, are certain people more susceptible to that developmental trauma than others? And I ask this question because my daughter, who has had a lot of her struggles, she was born a highly sensitive person. I mean,
Wow.
from the youngest of young ages, she was sensitive in every way. She didn't like the feeling of clothes on her body. She didn't like the texture of foods. She didn't like loud noises. And I would, bring her places that other little kids would be, like a park or a birthday party or a play group, and all the other kids are like running around like maniacs, like young children do. And maybe someone steals a toy from them or does something that is unkind towards them, and on the outside they don't seem to care, right? They're like, they either get mad back or they just run off and grab another toy or whatever the case may be. And I would see what I didn't at that time, I wouldn't have called it that because I just wasn't as aware. But now I would say almost like a trauma response in my daughter. And she was like 2 and 3 years old. And so this is like normal acts of living, right? This is children playing together, doing what children do in a very uncivilized way of doing it, you know? And this happened over and over and over in her childhood. And of course, there was no way of me preventing that. But you know, obviously other kids, I didn't feel the other kids were being traumatized by these behaviors, but she was. So is there, you know, are certain people just more susceptible based on maybe their sensitivity to the outside world?
I mean, I'm like writing down a lot of things that I don't want to forget, right? As you're
Yeah.
talking. So the first thing that I wrote down was epigenetics. So I want to address epigenetics. You're a nurse. Are you
I
familiar with
yes.
epigenetics?
Yes, I
Okay.
am. Yes.
So just as a layman, like epigenetics is this idea that when we're born with our DNA, right? Our DNA can be modified and shifted a little bit, that you're inheriting from other people in our lives. You, like your mother, your grandmother, your great grandmother, traumas and things that they experience, that shift in DNA can actually be inherited into our own system, right? And a great book to understand that is a book called What Happened to You. No, that's not that book. That's a good book too, by the way. I talk about that book a lot. That's
Yeah.
Dr. Bruce Perry. No, this particular book, the one about epigenetics, is It Didn't Start With You.
Mm,
And it's written by a guy named Mark Wolin. And it was such a great book to understand how trauma actually can be inherited through our DNA. So my first thought was, oh, could be some epigenetics, right? With regards
mhm,
to your daughter, potential. I'd be very curious about doing a genogram or doing some sort of familial study to
mhm.
see, how people lived and how they interacted and communicated in generations prior to you and what their experiences may have been. But the other thing that I was thinking of is, if you remember, trauma is never the event.
Right. It's
It's
the
the way,
interpretation of the
it's the
event, right?
interpretation, and it's the way that something is experienced, again, either in our mind or body or our psyche. It's When I was being trained by Marissa Peer for rapid transformational therapy, she was really clear on saying there are really three things that hold people back. I'm not enough, I'm different, or what I want is not available to me. It can be available to everybody else, but because I'm not enough and because I'm too different, it's
Mhm,
not going to be available to me. Right. And
mhm,
so I have children that I have a child that's neurodivergent. I have a child that is diagnosed ADHD. And I've learned so much about that over my parenting time, and what it is and what it's not, and how uneducated people are
mhm.
about ADHD and the big Venn diagram that it is.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of sensitivity that comes in with being neurodivergent or being on the spectrum or having OCD or any of these things. And if someone taking something away from us, if we are more sensitive, right? Like, I love this concept of the highly sensitive person because I
Mm,
have a few of these people in my household
mhm.
where everything is just experienced bigger.
Yes. Yes.
Sounds are bigger, smells are bigger, touch is bigger. I used to
Taste,
take Everything's
everything.
bigger.
Mhm.
When I used to take my child to get their hair cut, and the person just using the comb on their hair
Yeah.
hurt.
Yeah.
Initially I went, what are you talking about? It doesn't hurt. But I listened, thank
Mhm,
God. And I was like, wow, maybe it really is a sensation for that child that I wouldn't perceive
mhm,
as being too much.
mhm.
Right. So if we are somebody that is inherently hardwired for everything being experienced bigger,
Mhm.
but we can see everybody else around us doesn't experience it that way,
Yeah.
and we're also ridiculed for it,
Mhm.
it's going to make us feel different.
Mhm.
And the thing is that we're all different. We're all unique,
Yeah.
but somehow, and that's a good thing, but somehow in those moments of perception and core belief developing, we're perceiving different as negative.
Yeah.
Right. And so as you're talking about that, that's what's coming to mind for me. It's like, well, if you know, it's like they say people with ADHD walk with so much shame. And part of the reason why is because they perceive the world differently.
Mm-hmm.
They don't have the language for that when they're in elementary school. They don't really even have the language for that in middle school per se,
Mm-hmm.
but they know it and they feel it and they sense it and they embody it and they watch and they look and they see, but they can do it differently, easier. But I know I'm smarter, actually. Like I
Mm-hmm.
know my intelligence off the charts. So why can't I? Not enough, shame,
Mm-hmm.
different, not available to me.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's what comes to me when you say that about your daughter, just
Mm-hmm.
having never met her, that there was probably a piece of her that just felt so different and so unique, but
Mm-hmm.
perceived in such a negative way and maybe even shamed for it. Like, why
Mm-hmm.
can't you just be like the other kids? Why can't we
Yeah.
just not get oversensitive or not feel more than everybody else is feeling? We don't know what we're doing as parents. We don't
Yeah.
realize that that's a problem.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I could see how that could have a profound impact. And that
Yeah.
right there is a perfect example of that non triple A kind of trauma,
Right. Right. Yes.
right?
Yes.
It's just this constancy of something else.
Yes. No, it's everything you're saying makes total sense. And I mean, just as a brief background, there was a lot of mental health trauma in my family going back generations. My brother has a very pretty severe ADHD and he's mildly autistic. And my mom has struggled. Like it's all around us. And so my daughter, I remember when she was little, someone gave me the book when she was probably 2 or 3. Someone gave me the book Highly Sensitive Child. Which I highly recommend for any parent who thinks that they have a highly sensitive
Agreed.
child. And then I think there's highly sensitive person or adult. There's
There
like an
is.
adult version of it,
Yeah.
which is also fantastic. But I have no idea how that book made it into my hands, but it somehow did. And I read it and it was like every single page. I was like, oh my gosh, this is her, like to a T. Like this is what because prior to that, I knew I could see the differences, like you're saying, because they were very obvious when you're in a group of children that this child is reacting and behaving and all that kind of stuff different than other children. But it was like, what's going on? Like, is this okay? Is this not okay? Like, is
Right.
this concerning? I'm not sure. Like, it's very confusing. And so to get that book was such a blessing because I was like, okay, great. I like this explains what's going on here. And so from her family of origin, she got a lot of support because there's also a lot of sensitive people in our family. So I think there's just a lot of people are sensitive to sensitivities, but the
Yeah.
outside world does not care.
Nope.
They do not care. Peers do not care. Often teachers do not care.
Well, yeah.
And so, I think people like this can also, even if their family is doing the best they can to be sensitive to their sensitivities, they're still going to feel that I'm different sense
That's
because the
right.
rest of
And
the world
the
is
funny
telling them
thing
that.
is going back to what you were talking about before, is just fall in line. Like I believe from my own personal experience that the least trauma informed space or the school districts. And
It's
so
true.
they really add fuel to the not enoughness fire.
Yeah.
And I have battled within my own school district for their lack of sensitivity and awareness and understanding and trying to get them to see the role that they play
Mhm.
in not just, whatever's going on within my own family, but like with most of the families around here.
Yeah.
Because, we're not in isolation, even though we feel like we're in isolation. There are many more people struggling than we realize because we don't talk about our struggles.
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
Because we've been told don't burden people with your
Mhm.
problems, don't air your dirty laundry, keep your shit to yourself. Sorry, I curse on my podcast.
No, it's fine. We curse on this podcast too. This is for moms.
Um, but we've been hardwired and we've been trained and domesticated to not share in struggle,
Yeah.
but we're actually hardwired for connection. So when we're
Hmm.
told not to connect when we need it the most, it's a real problem,
Yeah, it is.
right? So, epigenetics is huge. I could have a whole other conversation with you about it.
Hmm.
Um,
I would love to
because
do that, by the way.
yeah, I just think if it were more understood and it
Hmm.
wasn't as on the fringe, though it's not really on the fringe in the trauma space,
Hmm.
right? Um, it would give deeper awareness to so many people, because one of the things I found so profound in that book, and I'd be curious to, I don't really think these things are taught in medical school or nursing school, but like when your grandmother was 4 months pregnant with
Hmm.
your mother had all her eggs. So
Hmm.
whatever your mother was experiencing in your grandmother's wounds is
Hmm.
going to be transferred into your DNA.
Yeah.
So we're just not that far removed
Hmm.
in 2024 from the Holocaust, from
Hmm.
slavery, from, issues in Ireland with poverty and
Hmm.
famine. We're
Hmm.
not that far removed from world wars. And we have great grandparents and grandparents who were in war,
Hmm.
who fled, who were immigrants, who came here with nothing, perhaps, who had to start from scratch, stress, 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 overwhelm,
Hmm.
overwhelm, overwhelm, trauma, trauma,
Hmm.
trauma.
Hmm.
And we're inheriting that shit.
Yeah.
And, I have this concept of this invisible backpack, which is like when people finally come in to my office or we're working on Zoom, I say, let's take the backpack off and look at what's in there. What are your
Yeah.
coping strategies? What are you carrying that's 6, 7 generations deep that you inherited that's no
Hmm.
longer relevant? And there's
Yeah.
another way to handle it other than just plow through.
Yeah.
You can change the DNA that's going to be going further down the stretch,
Right.
further
Right.
down
Down
the
the
stretch.
stream. Yeah. Yeah.
Let's break that cycle. We're a generation of cycle breakers in this generation, I think.
Hmm. That's my hope. That's my hope. And it's one of my main motivations for starting this podcast because I've had my own struggles, physical and mental health struggles. And then I had, my struggles with my daughter. And I thought, I went on my own spiritual journey because of that and
Hmm.
learned so much and healed so much and understood so much and all of these beautiful changes. But again, it was all on my own, right? There was no community to do this. This was like something that I needed to do. And then so I took that deep dive, but then I thought, my goodness, like we need to get this out here. Like we need
Yeah,
to get this information out. We need to let people know what is available and how they can be helped or how they can help their children, but also that they're not alone. Like you said, that they're not alone. Let's
100%.
start the conversation because every other person you run into or more is going to be having some sort of similar struggle to you. And so let's get it out there. Let's not be silent anymore. And let's transform a generation. So
Agreed.
I love that. And my understanding also of epigenetics is that um, it's not just like what you come into this world with, but also what gets turned on once you're in this world.
Mhm.
So you come in with certain genetics, whatever they may be, but then experiences, exposures to even like viruses or bacteria or chemicals or whatever the case may be, can either turn on or turn off a part of a gene that then the gene now starts expressing itself in a different way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, for
So,
sure. And look, this all comes down to a concept of window of tolerance. Are you
mhm.
familiar with the window of
No, that I
tolerance at
haven't
all?
heard of.
So, the window of tolerance is this concept where, life happens within this window. Okay. And either we have a really short window, and what we normally hear is we have a short bandwidth for shit, or we have low tolerance for this nonsense. Right.
Okay.
So, think of that bandwidth or that tolerance as this window. Life moves like this, right? It's
Hmm.
not a straight line. And so above the window is hypervigilance, okay, or hyper arousal. And that's where we feel stress and panic and overwhelm, and our nervous system and that vagus nerve is hijacked in such a way and activated in such a way that is causing real panic in our system.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Or we have hypoarousal, which is below the bottom of the window. And that looks more like extreme fatigue, illness, chronic inflammation, chronic pain, depression, lethargy. It's like that low energy vibe, right?
Okay.
And the idea is that when we come into life, perhaps if we're already carrying the stressors from past generations, we already have like too narrow of a window. If we can
Mm.
widen our window, and there are things I work with on my clients of widening their window as life moves up and down, the wider the window, the less time life is spent in this hyper or this hypo
Mm.
state. The more
Okay.
narrow your window when life's going like this, you have
Mm-hmm.
more extremities of we're in this space or we're in this space, right? We're
Mm-hmm.
either in this hyperspace longer or we're in this hypospace longer. Some people, this polyvagal theory, some people have this theory that's been proven that we automatically move into a hyperarousal. And if we're there too long, our body literally cannot take it. And our stress response will say, she's going to die from all of this exposure to this hypervigilance. And so I'm going to drop her down and she's going to flop. And it's like the spiral. And you're going to drop into this lethargy. And so the idea there is that depression or lethargy or fatigue or this low mobility state
Mm-hmm.
comes from having already been in this hyper arousal state, even if we can't express it,
Mm-hmm.
but we're now dropping,
Okay.
right? And so, how do we get out of that state? How do we move back into like this ventral vagal space
Mm-hmm.
where your nervous system is more regulated, right? So, we're really talking about within the window is the regulation, outside of the window is the dysregulation.
Mm-hmm.
And when we don't have the bandwidth or we don't have the tolerance for life, which we
Mm-hmm.
hear all the time, because that windows become very narrow.
Okay.
So part of the work is why is it narrow? A, but B, what can we do to widen it?
Mm-hmm.
So when life is blah, 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 all over the place, we're
Mm-hmm.
spending less time in these states. And when we're in these states, we can recognize it.
Mm-hmm.
And how do we have the tools to move back in and widen that window again? What I love about this concept is it gives the person a lot of agency. What it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't do is say, well, you have anxiety disorder, you have depression, and it's the label, and you have
Mm-hmm.
no choice because that's just what you're walking with.
Right.
And I'll teach you tools on how to navigate it,
Mm-hmm.
but you're always going to have it.
Right.
I can't stand that
Mm-hmm.
because I don't prescribe to that concept.
Yeah.
I prescribed of these are states of being. And
Mm-hmm.
if we can widen this window, we can change and improve the duration, the intensity, and the frequency that we're in these states that are
Mm-hmm.
hindering our life,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. I love that. I love that explanation. That's fantastic. So how do people, I guess I have two questions for you. One related to what you just said and then one going back. So the one related to what you just said is how do people always know that their window is small, right? Or are they walking around not really recognizing that or maybe projecting that onto other people? Like my window is fine, not that they're saying that, that exact term, but like I'm fine, it's everybody else, or
Yeah,
it's normal, my life, just because of my life, that's why I'm always up here or I'm always down
100%.
here.
That's
So
generally what people are walking with. And this is why I try to get on as many speaking engagements as possible and on many podcasts as possible to give a new lens through which to see this challenge, because it's not that life is more difficult. Look, I am not saying that people don't have more difficulties in life. I myself have been riddled with a lifetime of really serious challenges.
Mhm.
But I've also learned, and I don't work in this space per se, I have a lot of friend coaches that are very like more in the quantum physics and like energy vibes and the law of attraction and Abraham Hicks. And I have a model of a brain sitting right next to me. Like I tend to be more cerebral in my work, but I don't discredit this
Mhm.
idea of the vibration. So when your window is low and short and narrow, we can start thinking a lot of things and believing a lot of things, then attract more of that thought.
Mhm.
Right. So when we're vibrating at a lower energy, we're going to attract lower things.
Mhm.
Right. So this concept of ask, believe, receive, like you want something different, but you have to believe it's available to you
Mhm.
in order to be open to receive it. You can't go around and say, I want different, but nobody in my life's ever had different. We all come from shit. So it's really not going to be happening anyway. Now
Mhm.
you're blocking that opportunity, right? So
Yeah.
that is a little bit of a different realm, but it's really what the law of attraction and universal law is built into, which is we're all energy, and whatever you put out, you get back.
Yeah.
Because whatever vibration you put out, it's all that you can receive.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So, no,
Mhm.
people are not walking around. I mean, my goodness, I just was working with a therapist. I had a client that had been a therapist for 35 years. And I erroneously said in our session, I mean, you know about the window of tolerance. So let's talk about it. And she looked at me like I was a deer in the headlights.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, wait, do you know about the window of tolerance? And she's like, I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
And she's been a therapist for 35 years.
Yeah. I've not that I'm a therapist, but we have had extensive time in the therapeutic field, and I've never heard that concept either.
And this is like trauma coaching 101,
Yeah.
and that's what I love about coaching in the trauma space. And specifically, I give full cred to where I went to school because
Yeah.
they are just phenomenal, which
Yeah.
is the International Association of Trauma Recovery Coaching. I mean, this was integral,
Yeah.
integral. This and attachment theory, truly,
Mhm.
were
Mhm.
integral to gaining a foundation of understanding of why we tick the way that we tick
Mhm.
and that it can change.
Yeah.
You're not harnessed, imprisoned to a diagnosis or a state of being.
Mhm.
There are ways, unless we started out with me saying I was in therapy from 15 to 35 and I was still having panic attacks. I was still in this hyper arousal.
Yeah.
Why? Because my window was so short.
Yeah.
And I also bought into the belief system that I came from a long line of very anxious people.
Mhm.
And so it was just my destiny. So
Mhm.
I gave up on having any agency over how I was going to navigate the world
Mhm.
until I got exposed to and understood, oh, wait, there's another lens through which I can look at this. And
Yeah.
this is much more empowering.
Yeah.
And I actually do have much more control over my nervous system because that's really what I see is my
Mhm.
nervous system's hijacked. That's
Yeah.
what I see anxiety is, right?
Mhm.
And how can I navigate that and how can I tone that?
Yeah. All right. So I want this actually segues perfectly into the other topic that you and I were discussing before we hit record, which is that kind of toxic positivities. Because you
Mm,
mentioned this, I'm going to attract to myself what I'm thinking and what my vibration is, which I am a firm believer in. I'm actually currently reading Quantum Body, which is Deepak Chopra's latest book. It's all
yeah,
about
so
this.
we're in it.
Yes. So I am on board with all that, but how does that sometimes, this is what I think happens, sometimes gets confused with toxic positivity, or in the spiritual world, we sometimes call it spiritual bypassing,
Mm,
where we think we need to like just stop having the negative thoughts. And what I see it as is, and you correct me if I'm wrong, but is like some negative thoughts are just like negative thoughts that there's not a lot of feeling associated with them. Like one that I find myself trapped in all the time is I don't have enough time. I'll say that all the time. I'm rushing around.
uh,
I'll be like, I don't have enough time. I don't have enough time, which is very negative, unhelpful, not going to draw to me what I want. Okay. But it's not related to an event or an experience or something that, happened to me in my life that was traumatic. And so when we try to just go straight to a positive thought, when there is a very negative feeling associated with that, that seems like,
I mean, it feels like personal gaslighting to me,
right, right. It
right?
just,
And
it's
it's
not, it
funny
doesn't feel
because
right.
I was at an event for rapid transformational therapy practitioners, and it was coming in on the heels of someone that was a training event that was happening. So there were some newer people getting trained in this. I had already been an alumni of this for a while. And I met a gal at this event who actually is like incredibly high up in like the Napoleon Hill space. She trained directly with Bob Proctor and like is a very high level person in this arena. And she was being vulnerable with me in a moment and saying that she was having a hard time in her divorce and things were really bad. And, you know, it was kind of a shit show. And like she was being vulnerable and honest. And then she just stopped herself. And she was like, no, I will not put any negative words into the space. Everything will be fine. What I desire is fineness. And like she just shifted, like, and I was like,
Yeah.
what the hell is
Yeah.
happening? And it was like so quick and so clear to me. And I just thought to myself, is that the way it is? Like, I don't deny Napoleon Hill's theories and I don't deny universal law and the law of attraction. I understand all of it and it all makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
But don't deny yourself your fucking reality.
Mm-hmm.
Because the reality was she was in a narcissistically abusive marriage.
Yeah.
And she was drowning in it and she needed to find a way out.
Yeah.
That was the reality of that situation.
Mm-hmm.
There was no changing that. There's nothing she could do to change the fact that she was now connected to somebody who was narcissistic. Her desiring something else was not going to change him.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Period. End of story. So you got to do it. And you know what? Coming out of that's going to be hard and it's going to be painful and it's going to suck.
Yeah.
Like, so I kind of get like really like amped up about this because the reality is life is a series of experiences that are divinely designed for you. I used to say life is a series of challenges that are divinely designed for you, but I changed it many years ago because I think all experiences are valid.
Mm-hmm.
But we are the ones that label all experiences good or bad.
Mm-hmm.
Period. End of story.
Yes.
We are the ones. Okay. And what we learned by watching Disney and all of these different things when we were really young, child of the 70s and 80s,
Mm-hmm.
is if it doesn't make us feel good, it's bad.
Yeah.
If it doesn't leave a good feeling, there's something wrong.
Yeah.
And by the way, don't tell anybody about it because we don't want anybody to know that there's anything wrong.
Right.
Right. Because then they'll
Mm-hmm.
think we're not perfect.
Yeah.
And they think we're flawed. And by the way, we are flawed. We're human beings, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not human
Mm-hmm.
doings.
Mm-hmm.
And so this idea of this toxic positivity, whereas we're only going to talk about things that are positive, we're only going to put a positive spin on it, versus this article I was promoting from the Atlantic that I love, what's called tragic optimism. And tragic optimism is I accept that life actually is really fucking hard. And I accept life is a series of experiences that I could choose to label as good or bad, challenging, hard, easy. Again, I'm labeling them, right? But whatever the experience was, even the ones that created the most pain for us, there's something to be learned. So the
Mm-hmm.
idea of tragic optimism is, you know, that really sucked, but here's what I gained. Like you being able to have this podcast, would you desire that your daughter not have ever experienced some of the challenges that she did? Of course you would. But what's the gift that came out of that challenge?
Mm-hmm.
The fact that now you have a voice, that maybe now you are diving deeper into understanding. It probably makes you a much better medical professional, a
Mm-hmm.
much better nurse,
Mm-hmm.
you know, a much better person at this hospital for their patients. So there's a benefit that's not just for you, it's the butterfly effect. It's going to touch thousands of people
Yeah.
because you're going to allow a patient to be seen and heard. They're going to vibrate differently. They're going to react to somebody differently. It's this huge effect,
Yeah.
right? So the
Mhm.
idea is, let's not just pretend that everything's okay and put a toxic spin of positivity on it,
Mhm.
which there's so many reasons why people do that. Let's just call it what it is. That was really painful, but this is how I shifted, even in this most micro way, towards who I'm supposed to be in this world
Mhm.
and what I'm supposed to know and what my purpose is and how I'm supposed to help and serve others.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree. And I think, we are human beings and we are having a human experience and we are meant to have feelings, right? That we are supposed to have all the feelings and we can label them whatever we want to label them. And we might prefer certain feelings over others, but we are meant to have all those feelings. The problem I see is when we get stuck in the feeling. So, there's been many times in my life where I was going through something where I would not have preferred to go through that thing. And I was labeling it as challenging or difficult. And I did have lower vibration, negative feelings about it, but I allowed it, right? So I allow myself to have those feelings. I sit with that, but then I say, okay, now I'm going to shift my perspective to something more that feels better
Mhm.
in my body, that feels
Mhm.
better in my mind. I'm going to shift my perspective. I'm not going to say that that's not there. I'm not going to deny that that's there. It's there and it's really hard. And I have these very uncomfortable feelings related to that thing, but I'm not going to roll around in the mud of it. I'm going to pick myself up from it and choose to shift my perspective. And then another day, those feelings might come raging back at me again, and I'm going to have to sit with them again. And we're going to just keep doing this process all over again. But I think that the gaslighting comes in, or the spiritual bypassing comes in, when we just deny that they're there and act like, I don't have those feelings. Everything's fine. It's fine. It's not fine all the
Well,
time.
and look, this is my wheelhouse, right? So if I were working with somebody and they said, this is the way that they navigate life and they recognize that it's not beneficial, my first question always is when did that start? And they
Yeah.
always laugh because, like, I don't know, it was like three,
Oh my
4,
gosh. Wow.
and this is not even under hypnosis. They just
Yeah.
know, like, if you listen to your body, you kind of just hear it.
Yeah.
And then I'll say, what was going on? Well, like it could have been anything. Maybe I'll just use some random example. This is just a menage of every session I've ever had. It's not specific, but it could be like, well, my dad was a war vet and he had like a lot of PTSD, but we didn't really understand that. So like he would come home from work, but my mom wanted to keep everything like settled in the house.
Mm.
Right. So, like, if he would come home from work and he just wants it to be really quiet and that's what's going to be better for him, then now everybody's tiptoeing around it. And he can't really handle when I'm sad, or he can't really handle when I'm not having a good day. So, I just would say, yeah, everything's fine. And then I could see I was getting a good response from that. So, that's what I learned.
Mhm.
Right.
Yeah.
Don't share.
Yeah.
It could be none of it's benign and all of it's benign.
Mhm.
None of it's malignant. None of
Yeah.
it's with intent, but you
Mhm.
learn to navigate life through this lens and it works.
Yeah.
So what's the motivation to not do it? Well,
Right.
the motivation is when you're in your 20s, 30s, 40s, by the way, now you work that way in your
Mhm.
profession, you have relationships that way in your life,
Mhm.
and you're unfulfilled
Yeah. I was
because
going to
now
say
you're
it works until it doesn't,
until
right?
it doesn't work. And so I
Yeah.
tend to grab the people at like when it doesn't work.
Yeah.
So most of my clients are like somewhere between 40 and 70. To be honest, I'd say the sweet spot's like 40 to 65.
Mm.
But even in that realm, and I work primarily with women, but not only women, they now are starting to see the benefit of this work. And I'm getting the phone calls. Can you see my daughter?
Mhm.
She's
Mhm.
18. She's 19. She's
Yeah.
20. I think you're exactly what's missing for her.
Yeah.
And originally I was like, no, I only really like to work with like the adults. But
Mhm.
then there was a part of me that was like, oh my God, if I could give a generation of women at the age of 19 or
Right.
20 years old this knowledge,
Yes.
Yes,
Yes. I
let's
mean,
go.
can they receive it is the question. Like with that
Of course they
prefrontal
can when
cortex
they're
undeveloped, like are they able to like
they
do this
can
work?
because it depends on where they are in their life. Like if these are people that have been doing the work in our children's generation. So I have a 19-year-old and a 14-year-old. In our children's generation, many of them have been going to therapy for a very long time.
Mm-hmm.
That wasn't the case for our generation,
Mm-hmm.
right? You're seeing kids in therapy in elementary school, middle school, high
Mm-hmm.
school. So maybe they're coming to me at 20 and they've been going to therapy since they were 13,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
And I literally had somebody tell me the other day, I'm therapy resistant.
Yeah.
Nothing's worked for me up to this point.
Oh,
How does that make somebody feel? I mean, that's
yeah.
traumatic in and of
That
itself.
is, that
Helpless,
is to feel like no
powerless,
hope.
hopeless.
Yeah.
Right? So I say,
Oh.
well, let's just give it a go. And she came to me because a family member came to me and they knew that family member walked with a lot of struggle. And they were like, wow, that's a shift. How'd you
Yeah.
do that? I don't call it a cure. I don't
Mm-hmm.
think anybody's ever done healing, but it's
Mm-hmm.
like a jump start on the healing journey. And it's a set of tools and it's like opening up a new lens to look at it through
Mm-hmm.
a very, very different way,
Yeah. Yeah.
And so why not? If a teenager, I don't work with anybody under 18, but if somebody's coming to me that is college age or young adult age, that's like, yeah, I have done it and yet I'm still stuck and I don't
Mm-hmm.
want to be. As
Mm-hmm.
long as they're ready, willing, and able, I say, let's go. But
Yeah.
if somebody's not showing me that they really want to do the work, it's not going to be money well spent.
Right.
I'm not going to do it.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, that's true of any type of therapy, right? If the person
Yeah.
isn't open and willing, then you're really not going to get any valuable effects from it.
Right.
Well, I love that, and I will keep you in mind for my daughter. But well, here's going back to that other question I had. So, if you're that parent who is trying your best not to traumatize your children,
Oh,
but
please.
yeah, doing the best you can. You are seeing things like I saw in my daughter when she was very young that I was like, this is out of my control. Like, what
Mhm.
can we do to buffer our young children? What can we do to like I'm not going to say that we're going to prevent them from experiencing any trauma ever. It's like
No.
not possible, but like, what can we do to like give them some resilience or to just help them navigate?
So it's funny. Like I said, my kids are 14 and 19, but I'm much older than a lot of my siblings. So I have nieces and nephews that are like 6, 4, 18 months old, right? And my siblings of younger children will be like, is there any way not to fuck up my kid? Like,
Right. I know. I'm always saying, what today am I
is
going to
there
put them on the
any
couch?
way for my kid
Yeah.
not to have trauma? And I'm like, well, of course not. Because remember, even if you create the best scenario, you can't control what's outside of your home either, right? So to me, the antithesis of it all is resilience, right? And it's understanding and it's communication. And so trust me, I have sat in psychiatrist's office and psychologist's office weeping in tears. I have added so much extra salt to the wound, right? I added so much more trauma, if you will, so much more dysfunction on top of what was already inherently their own, riddled with guilt,
Mm-hmm.
riddled with guilt.
Yeah.
So trust me, even as a trauma specialist, I
Mm-hmm.
am not void of that. Okay.
Yeah.
But what I've taught my siblings is the one thing that I've learned is when I knew I could do better, I admitted it.
Mm-hmm.
And I would find myself coming in and like losing my shit with my
Mm-hmm.
kids because why? I'm tired. I'm dysregulated. I'm
Mm-hmm.
stressed out about something that
Yeah.
has nothing to do with them. And by the way, my window of tolerance is like a sliver.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, this is well before I understood even what a window of tolerance was.
Yeah.
A sliver was like a floss. Okay. Like non existent.
Yeah.
And they sneeze the wrong way or they're fighting at the counter or whatever it is. And I lose my mind because
Mm-hmm.
I just literally don't have the bandwidth.
Yeah.
And then I'll walk in and I'll say, that was not my best. And actually, this is the reason why I'm so stressed out. It actually has nothing to do with you. It has to do with this thing over here and this thing over here and this thing over here. And if I could have done this differently, this is the way I would have done it.
Yeah.
Because here's the one thing I've learned that's powerful and scary is that anytime a child feels unseen, unheard, insignificant, anything that happens before they're 9 on a consistent basis, the only thing they can come up with is it must be me. Because they don't have a rational, right? I know.
Breaks my heart.
I know. Their rational brain is not developed, but there's some sense of, well, you're the adult, so you know better. So if I'm being treated like shit, I must be the problem.
Yeah.
Right? So at least being able to say to your child, you're not the problem. This wasn't about you in this moment. And I'm sorry. And that was not okay. And let me tell you what I do know about you. And really try to negate it. It doesn't mean it's going to be perfect. But one thing I learned, I had one child, my highly sensitive child, who was just felt everything so
big.
and
yes.
like every tantrum was like so epic and like, you know, it was slamming doors and moving furniture and it was like all this stuff. And you know, at one point you're like, you're compassionate to like the fact that like they're having this very dysregulated moment, but at the same time, like you're not going to condone flipping over a chair. And so what I learned to say to my child is, I love you, but I don't love the choices you're making on how to express yourself. I think that there are other ways to learn how to do it. Now, was I saying that in the hot moment? Maybe not. But again, it's anytime we can go back within a pretty decent amount of time and say, I was thinking about it. And I just want you to know how much I love you. And what I did was actually not okay. Versus saying, I know what I did, but I love you. Because we can then cross that barrier of like love is pain, right? Or love is dysfunction. What it really needs to be is I recognize this was not okay. And this is why it wasn't okay. And this is what I would have liked to have done differently. But I'm just a work in progress. Like there's no, I can't count how many times I've said to my children, there's no manual for this.
Right.
I don't really know what I'm doing. So like, I feel really bad. I have guilt for having done it that way. And just being like as blatantly honest as I could be.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that I am going to not traumatize my kid. But I think the more that there's just a general understanding of you're valuable, you are worth to be seen, heard, you're significant, you're important, you belong.
Yeah.
And I've got you no matter what. Even if I'm angry with you right now, I'm allowed to be angry with you.
Right.
I'm not thrilled with what you did. And I'm going to teach you how it could have been done differently.
Yeah.
But you still matter because you are not your behavior.
Yeah. That's
And
beautiful.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah. That repair is, there's a parenting expert that I listen to a lot, and she talks a lot about the repair, going back and doing
Is that
repair.
Miss Dr. Becky?
Yes.
Yeah, I hear her talk about that too. And I'm so grateful for her because my sister's in this age, you know, she's 39 and I've been hearing about this Dr. Becky for so long from her. And this is the kind of stuff that was missing. I'm in my 50s. This was missing for women in their 50s who were raising children in our 30s. That didn't really exist. So go Dr. Becky.
Go Dr. Becky.
The rupture and repair is real.
Yeah.
And you can repair it in the moment. You really can.
You can.
It's just being mindful. And it's
And
okay to say it.
That window of tolerance you were talking about, as you were explaining that, I was thinking, well, in order to do that, you really have to work on your own window of tolerance, right? Because that takes some regulation on your part. That takes you to be regulated enough to either not go above your window of tolerance, or maybe you go above your window of tolerance, but quickly recover and recognize that's what you did, and then make that repair in enough time.
And I think this is what I've been hearing my sister tell me about. Like, I don't really spend a lot of time following Dr. Becky, but
Mhm.
I, the things I do see that come up in my feed, I'm like, oh, that's brilliant, you know? And
Yeah.
it really is. It's like, if you really want different for your children, it
Mhm.
doesn't start with your child.
Right. No, no, no,
It
no. It
doesn't
all
start
starts
with your
with you.
child.
Yes.
It
Yes.
starts with you. And
Yeah.
that's like a huge gulp of humility of
Mhm.
I'm not a finished product
Mhm.
and I have so much to learn. And even if I'm 40, 50, 60, 70 years old, I want to learn it because I want better for the generations below me or the people around me. And it
Yeah.
starts with me. It
Mhm.
starts with me. And the parents that can grasp that and are willing to gain that radical awareness and that
Mhm.
awakening, then everything falls from there.
Yeah. Yeah. That's beautiful. Beautiful. All right. I want to be mindful of your time, but we never actually talked about the specific therapy you do. We talked
Oh,
about all these other things. Do you have a moment to talk
yeah, we
about
do.
that?
Sure.
Okay. So let's tell us about the specific therapy you did. You mentioned the name of it in the beginning. I apologize. I
Yeah.
can't remember the name.
So I was trained by a woman named Marissa Peer. It's Peer. And Marissa is a psychotherapist that developed her own therapeutic model done under hypnosis many years ago.
Okay.
And the name of that model is rapid transformational therapy. And I utilize it with the majority of my clients, not all of my clients, but basically it's a therapeutic model that's done under hypnosis that is a culmination of cognitive behavioral therapy, neurolinguistic programming, neuroscience, universal laws. There's some meditation in there. When somebody does a RTT session with me, which I don't offer it on its own, it's part of a larger program that I offer. That session, that one session is anywhere from 2 to 2.5 hours long. And I would say 2 hours of it is underneath hypnosis.
Yeah.
So if they're going to be with me for 2.5 hours, maybe we're chatting for 15 minutes and then we're kind of like wrapping it up once they're no longer in that state for like maybe another 15 minutes. Right. But the purpose of that particular therapeutic model is if they've worked with me, they'll have already had maybe 3 or 4 hours with me where we have uncovered and really gotten very clear on like the overarching challenge that's holding somebody back. It's the big container, the not enoughness, the
Mhm.
needing to be perfect, the inability to set boundaries, the extreme people pleasing,
Mhm.
believing I'm different. I've worked with people and believing they don't matter, you
Mhm.
know, and these are the big overarching things that I help them get language around in our
Mhm.
sessions prior.
Mhm.
When we get into that therapeutic model, we're directly accessing the subconscious to get to the root of when that started, how, why, when, where, with whom, right? And the reason why it's important to do it under hypnosis is because if you look at these like iceberg images where they're like, oh, 10% or 30% of your life is being lived in your conscious mind, and
Mhm.
then like everything else is down here below,
Yeah.
you know, all of your core beliefs. A core belief is what you think about yourself and how you think you need to interact with others in the world
Mhm.
are developed by the time you're 12. They're based on the experiences that you've had and they're hidden in your subconscious. So I think of your subconscious as like a database where every single experience you've had is stored in your mind
Mhm.
and it's tagged with what did you feel
Mhm.
and what did that cause you to believe about yourself in the moment. So I'll give you an example. We'll use not enoughness because we do this one a lot here.
Mhm.
Um, so benign. I'll say, okay, we want to go back to a root, the reason, the cause for where this not enoughness started.
Mhm.
And the person might say, and I only use this because I hear it a lot. I'm 18 months old. I'm in the high chair.
People can remember back that far?
And remember, this is not a conscious memory.
Yeah.
Okay, what's going on there? My parents are fighting. Okay. And how are you feeling? Alone. Why? Because I'm crying and nobody's turning around and paying attention. How else do you feel? Scared? Why? Because they're fighting and I don't like the loud noises. How else do you feel? Confused? Why? Because they're not turning around and paying attention to me. Okay. So at the age of 18 months, repeat after me. I feel scared, confused, and alone. All I could do in that moment was what? Stuff down those feelings. And what did you learn about yourself in that moment? To stay small.
Mm.
So simple, but so profound. Okay,
Yeah.
let's go back to another moment, all having to do with not feeling enough, but also these feelings, because it's the feelings that create the belief. We are feeling machines
Mhm.
until we're 9, 10, 11, 12, because that's how we navigate the world,
Mhm.
right? So we work on getting clarity on where did this all start? And then we start reframing. But that's not me because I'm not 18 months old anymore. I'm 50. And this is what I do know
Right.
about myself. And at that time, I didn't have a voice. Literally, I was pre-verbal, but now I do. And it's
Mhm.
okay for me to express myself. And we start reframing and getting them to see, because all this stuff rooting in the subconscious, it's your foundation.
Mhm.
Okay. Then we do some parts work. So I'm trained also in parts work, which is based on internal family systems with Dick Schwartz, which is an incredibly powerful therapeutic model. And we start talking to the part that is not enough, right? So when we talk about coming back to self, we're all born with a self, but then
Mhm.
we fracture ourselves from that self over time to navigate the stresses in our life. So
Mhm.
we want to talk to the part that's kind of driving the bus, and we start finding out what it thinks its benevolent role is for the person
Mhm.
until they can start to see that it's actually hindering them, not helping them.
Mhm.
And I help create that dialogue. Then, based on all that's come up, I have a handful of other tools in my toolbox that I'll pull out. And then at the very end, we reframe a little bit more. But at the very, very end, which is really important, is the 4 hours I've worked with the person prior, we've decided to talk about what life could look like without this problem. What would it look like if I actually did believe I was enough? What would it look like if I did have confidence, if I did have self esteem, if I did believe I was deserving of the things I really, really want? And so
Mhm.
we together create a custom meditation for that person. So in the last, say, 10 to 20 minutes, however long it is, when they're still under hypnosis, I speak it into existence, but I record that last piece. So when the session is over and they've left, I then mix it with some binaural music, like frequency meditation
Mhm.
music,
Mhm.
theta brainwave. And I send it to them and I say, I really want you to listen to this for 21 days. We're going to rewire your brain for
Mhm.
new suggestions, right? You've been giving
Mhm.
yourself this old suggestion. We're going to do some neuroplasticity work here. And we're going to continue to meet over those 21 days. And we want to see what kind of micro shifts are coming up.
Mhm.
And just to finish this off, I'll give you an example of a micro shift. So I have a client I worked with many years ago. She's an artist, and she actually had one of those AAA traumatic childhoods, right? There was like no denying how
Mhm.
traumatic this was. And she really had this, I need to stay small, not enoughness. I can't really express myself. I'm going to deprioritize myself. Extreme people, please. And after our session, she had gone to Detroit for an art exhibition, and she was with 6 women, and there was enough sleeping for 4. And one was going to have to sleep on a couch, and one was going to have to sleep on an air mattress. And she's in her 50s. And she said, this was the micro shift for me so quickly. She goes, the old version of me would have been like, I'll take the couch. But she goes, I suffer from migraines. And if I don't get good sleep, I'll get a migraine. And if I'm on a migraine on this trip, I'm going to have a horrible time. So for
Mhm.
the very first time in my life, I spoke up and said, ladies, I really need a bed. I
Mm.
need to be able to have a bed. And everybody was like, yeah, sure, whatever, no problem.
Yeah. Yeah.
And she goes, and just standing up for myself in that moment, I got better sleep. I
Mhm.
didn't have a migraine. I was happy of so proud of myself for
Mhm.
speaking up. And I also got to see it wasn't going to be a problem.
Yeah.
And she said it was so profound, but so simple.
Right.
And it's those little things that I'm helping them identify in those 21 days, because as we pull them all together, that's where the profound impact is,
Yeah.
right? Does that make
Hmm.
sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. And that's really
Yeah.
beautiful. I mean, I really got chills when you said that because it is small, but it's not. It's actually really
100%.
big. It's really
Huge.
big. And the moment she does that and sees that actually the world doesn't fall apart and actually everybody's okay with it, it the more likely she is to do it again, right? The more
That's right.
empowered she feels to keep making those types of decisions in her life and not just with the small things, it can grow into the bigger things, which is
100%.
how someone changes their whole world. So that's amazing.
Yeah, it's an amazing therapeutic model, and I always give credit to Marissa for creating it. I just got
Yeah.
trained in it. And I
Right. Right.
think I will say I do think and I'll give myself some self-praise here. I know I'm very good at it, and I think the reason why I'm so good at it is because I am so trauma informed and I'm so trauma trained, and
Hmm.
I've learned so much through my own experiences that I'm seeking and listening in a way and guiding in a way that's so trauma focused that
Hmm.
the impact is very profound for
Yeah.
the receiver.
How long, so this whole process, how long does someone usually work with you?
That program's 2 months long.
2 months.
So,
That's a big shift in 2 months.
it's a big shift in 2 months, and that's what I
Yeah.
love about it. And
Yeah.
the way I do it is it's 4 coaching sessions. It's kind of weeked out, right? So, like
Yeah.
week 1 is a coaching session, week 2 is a coaching session, week 3 is the hypnosis, which again is like 2.5 hours long. Week 4, we meet again. And then
Hmm.
like we put in like 2, maybe 3 weeks, and then we have another session. So now we're
Yeah.
expanding. How's life happening? We're
Right.
not meeting every week. What are you seeing? What's so
Yeah.
beautiful, if you think about working with a traditional therapist that doesn't know hypnosis, right?
Hmm.
And there are some fantastic therapists that are getting trained in EMDR and some
Hmm.
of these other really profound um methodologies that help crack wide open the things that
Hmm.
I'm helping crack wide open here, is
Hmm.
at the end they're like, well, can we continue to work together if that's what they choose? Because now I have an understanding of what's under the hood.
Right.
Think
Right.
about
Yeah.
how long it takes to get under the hood
Right.
with a
Yeah.
therapist, right? So if someone's
Absolutely.
working with a therapist and they want more of this, find out if the therapist is trauma informed, because
Hmm.
not all therapists are trained in trauma. It's not a part of a therapy degree
Hmm.
or credentialing.
Hmm.
You have to go and get it on your own,
Right.
and find out if they're trained in either rapid transformational therapy or EMDR. I've never
Hmm.
done EMDR myself, but when I've worked with other trauma therapists and we collaborate, my understanding is it's very similar in
Hmm.
nature.
Hmm.
Not the way it's done per se, but the questioning and the outset of it, like what
Yeah.
it is that you can gain as a result of it.
Yeah. Yeah. I've heard really great things about EMDR. I haven't had
Yeah.
someone on this show who specializes in that. And that is in my future. I have that planned because it is really fascinating form of therapy. But
Yeah.
well, thank you so much. This was fantastic. I really appreciate all of your wisdom and knowledge and that you stayed on extra just to give us more information. It was fantastic, Stacey. Thank you
I'm
so much.
Listen, I'm incredibly passionate about getting people to get to that aha moment.
Mhm.
That's all I'm really trying to do most of the time. It's like, I
Yeah.
just need somebody to go, oh my God, like this could be available to me.
Yeah.
I've not tried that. Like, I've not looked at it through that lens. I've never really understood it that way. That level of aha, in and of itself, can just start such a ripple effect for
Yeah.
people to go on a very different self exploration than they've been on before. And
Yeah.
that's really my goal.
Yeah. Because, and I think there's, what you're getting at is a block that, like you're saying, in traditional therapy, it might take you God knows how long to get to because it's buried so deep and you're just going like straight to the source,
I go
straight
straight
to
to
the
the
source.
jugular. And it
Yeah.
was funny because I met with somebody for a consultation earlier this week, and I wasn't sure if she was ready to go for the jugular. So
Right.
at the end of the, consultation, I said, let me tell you the 2 ways I work. Cause I either work in
Right.
that program or you just do straight coaching with me, one to
Right.
one, 75 minutes, conscious level.
Yeah.
But I'm trained in a way that I do kind of get to the root a lot of the times, but
Okay.
not the way I can when I'm doing rapid transformational therapy.
Right.
She said to me, she's 56 years old. I've done the work. I've turned over every rock. Let's just go for it. Like I just want to go to the jugular. I was like, great,
Yes.
let's
Let's do
rock and
it.
roll.
Yeah.
Let's rock and roll. But it is nice when people feel like, wow, maybe I really could. If they want understanding. Why don't I
Yeah,
understand?
of
Why don't I feel
course.
enough? Why, when
Yeah.
people tell me I'm a good person, I'm thinking to myself, if you really knew me,
Yeah.
you'd really
Yeah.
not know. How do they not see
Yeah.
that? I want to understand why I don't like myself. Why can't I care for myself? Why don't I
Yeah.
love myself? Why
Yeah.
can't I receive that kind of praise?
Yeah.
Right. And when they
Yeah.
can get that and they can change it,
Mm-hmm.
it's life altering.
Life altering. And like you said, if we can start doing that with the generation younger, their whole lives be different.
Huge. Whole
Whole
lives.
lives
And
will be
think of
different.
the ripple down effect of that.
I do. I do think of the ripple down effect, and I
Yeah.
think it would be very profound.
Very.
Yeah,
We need it
we
fast.
do. We do. We do. We need to go for the jugular.
We're getting to the cliff and it doesn't look good.
Yes, absolutely. All right. Well, I will put your stuff in well, I'm going to put access to that article that you
Yeah.
posted so everyone can take a listen to that. I'll also put that It Didn't Start With You book in there for everyone to take a look at. You have a website?
I do. It's flipyourmindset.com.
Flipyourmindset.com. And then I'm looking at your microphone there. Flip That Shit.
Oh,
That's your podcast.
well, it was. So, it's now Flip Your Mindset because I'm trademarking Flip Your Mindset, and trademarking is really expensive. And
Oh, okay.
so
We're
I've
just going
always
all,
had my
yeah.
podcast as Flip That Shit, which everybody loved, but I
Yeah.
don't know that I want to drop another few grand just to trademark that
Trademark.
name.
Got it.
So you can find my podcast at Flip Your Mindset.
Okay. Flip Your Mindset. Okay. I'll put all of that in the show notes so everyone can know where to find you
Thank you so
and get
much.
these great resources that we talked about.
Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you so much, Stacey. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you. You too.